Whereabouts are we?
We're at the corner of 2nd and Commercial at Continental Coffee. I've always felt kind of a sense of dislocation living here, even though this was one of the few places where I was comfortable for the most part. But I always kind of characterize as, well, I'm an artist, and that sense of dislocation creates a certain amount of anxiety and edge, which is great for creating. But I've been here a long time, and I'm getting older, and that didn't cut it anymore. I lived here for 30 years, and I'm writing about Pennsylvania all the time, and creating songs and poems and theater that deals with that part of my life. But this is where I live, and I started to really feel a desire to make a connection with the place I lived as an artist, but I never decide what I'm going to write. It shows up, and I almost download it, and it was awful to begin with. I had very little sense of composition, but then it started to develop my work, and people started commenting on it, and I started noticing that I was seeing the street in a different way, really seeing people in a different way, and being aware of them and the little nuances and moments. And I just realized, oh, I'm doing it. I'm connecting to this place. So the street photography allows me to connect with this place and the people in this place in a way that I can be detached and observing and yet still connected. And it's an established artistic tradition, street photography, but it does make some people uncomfortable creating art using other people's images. And you need to show some grace, right? Because you're not asking for their permission, right? You're bringing them into your art, using them as part of your practice. And that requires, you need to show more appreciation for that. And that means sometimes people are going to get upset. So yes, it is a collaboration. It's more about me observing and sort of not getting in the way, so I can capture moments, because I don't like to do posed photographs. I'm not a portrait photographer. So it's a different kind of collaboration, because they don't necessarily know they're collaborating. But there's an art to not being seen. I was around the Vancouver sort of poetry scene for a long time, and in my 20s and early 30s I was part of a thing called the Duct Tape Platypus Poets Coalition, a bunch of young poets, and we did like staged readings, and it was very, we're from the street, man, and spoken word, and it wasn't very good. So, but I was Russell Thornton, who's a very established Canadian poet. I liked him, and I was on his show on Co-op Radio, and then he was very kind. My poems were at that point, they just weren't very good. I hadn't found my voice yet. But he took an interest in me, and we started emailing and talking on the phone, and he'd start giving me feedback on my poems, and in a way that I didn't realize that he was mentoring me. I don't think I would have got my first book of poetry published if it hadn't been for Russell. And then I came across Bukowski. And I was a drunk then. And I got in fights in the street and in bars, and this guy was writing poetry, and it was poetry I could relate to. And he gave me permission to write poetry, and that my language, my person, was enough for the page. My dad took us, my dad left the military, deserted the Marine Corps, and came to Canada after his second tour in Vietnam. So we lived way up north in the bush, right? We weren't like off a logging road 10 miles from town. We were miles and miles, flown in by bush plane, right? Because he was a hunting guide, and I was just a little guy. So I was surrounded by mountains and wilderness and animals. And then my mom took us from there and brought us back to Pittsburgh. And Pittsburgh was a very industrial city. But strangely enough, as a child, I spent most of my time hanging out alongside the Allegheny River. I went there all the time, and it was the only bit of nature we had. Besides, there were woods and stuff in the hills outside where we lived, And so we would go and hang out in those places, but mostly it was the river. And then there was like these scrub woods kind of along the river where me and my brothers would hang out. And I was always very drawn to those places. And I think I found some kind of refuge from the intense industrial urban setting. The Allegheny River was profoundly polluted, right? The only fish that survived in it were carp and catfish because they could survive. They were bottom feeders. They could eat anything, right? If they would stock the creeks. We say cricks in Pennsylvania, and that's one of those words that they would stock the creeks for trout season with trout. And any of the trout that actually made it to the river would die because the river was so grossly polluted. And the carp and the catfish would come in to feed on that stuff. And we would fish for them. We were so excited, and we would look at them. And so there was a fascination with nature, but it was this kind of nature that had been deformed by this intense industrialization and pollution. And yet, I think I owe, in a strange way, a lot of who I am as a person. I think that river, I have a poem called The Allegheny, which talks about this. That river, in a way, kind of saved me as a kid. So the book launch, Fishing for Leviathan, which Anvil Press is putting out. We're having a book launch. It's kind of a concert, a celebration. The book launch is Friday, June 2nd, and it's at Backspace, which is just down on 1318 Grant Street, so just a few blocks away. And it's Blake Williams' art studio, warehouse. He does big public art projects, so he has this big space. And occasionally he opens it up to, artists like myself to do events in. And it's through the back alley, and I'm going to be playing with my band. I'll be reading poems, performing some poems and songs with my band. C.R. Avery is going to perform. Fraser McKenzie will do a couple songs. Some of my street photography will be on exhibit. And Anvil will be selling books, of course, too.